They said she was too old to matter, too worn down to be worth saving. On a dust-choked street in Kansas, a woman stood silent as strangers decided her fate, until one man stepped forward and refused to look away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He did something far more dangerous. He chose compassion. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Dodge City in late August looked like a town that had been left too long in the sun. The sky was a hard, washed-out blue, and the heat sat over the streets the way a heavy blanket sits over a sickbed, smothering, unavoidable, and strangely intimate. Dust hung in the air, stirred by wagons and cattle drives, and it settled everywhere. In the cracks of boardwalks, in the folds of shirts, along the rims of tired eyes. The Arkansas River ran lower than it should have, its banks exposed and ugly, and the smell of hot manure and leather never quite lifted. People moved with an economy of motion that came from living through a season that asked for more than it offered. Even laughter sounded thin. The auction had been set up in the open square near Front Street, where men usually argued about cards and rail schedules. A wooden platform stood in the center, rough boards nailed together without care. It wasn't meant for dignity. It was meant for visibility. A table sat beside it, and behind the table stood the auctioneer, tall, narrow, and too clean for a man pretending to do hard work. His mustache was waxed into points, his shirt was pressed, and his boots shone as though they had never met mud. He kept wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, but the sweat returned instantly, sliding down his temples in a steady line. A crowd had formed early. Not a festival crowd. No music, no children running through legs, no feeling that anyone had come to celebrate. It was the kind of gathering that appeared when people sensed weakness. Hungry men, bored men, women with arms crossed and eyes sharp, a few boys perched on crates to see better. The drought had turned everyone into accountants. When food ran short, compassion was the first luxury to be cut. On the platform stood Eleanor Price. She was 58, not tall, not fragile, simply worn down into something spare and durable. Her shoulders were squared, and she held herself as if she had long ago learned that posture was the last thing a person could control. Eleanor's hair, once likely dark, was now mostly iron gray, pulled into a tight bun that exposed a neck browned by sun. Her face showed the blunt arithmetic of hard years, fine lines around her mouth, creases at the corners of her eyes, a dryness in her lips from too little water and too much wind. She wore a faded brown dress that had been mended repeatedly, the stitching visible in uneven seams. A gray shawl was wrapped around her shoulders even in the heat, part habit, part armor. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers slightly curled. They were hands built for work, knuckles thickened, nails short, skin rough with healed cracks. If someone had tried to call those hands old, Eleanor might have corrected them. They were not old, they were used. Her bare feet were planted on the boards. The wood had been baking in the sun since morning, and the heat rose through her soles. She did not shift her weight. She did not look down. Her eyes, clear blue, steady, were fixed over the crowd, not staring at any one person. It was the gaze of someone who refused to beg. The auctioneer raised his voice. "Eleanor Price," he announced, reading from a slip of paper like a man reciting a list of tools. 58 years old, still able to work, cooking, mending, light laundry, no troublemaker, can read and keep accounts. A few people chuckled at the last part, as if literacy in a woman that age was a joke. The auctioneer smiled tightly, encouraged by the sound. "She's not young," he continued, "but she's capable. Who'll start the bid?" Silence answered him at first. Not the respectful kind, just the slow silence of a crowd deciding whether the spectacle was worth their money. A stout woman near the front, sun-reddened arms, hair pulled back, a mouth set in permanent irritation, snorted, "Sharp mind doesn't cook supper." A man beside her laughed, exposing brown-stained teeth. Another voice, younger and louder, called out, "Who'd waste flour on someone with one foot in the grave?" The crowd responded in low murmurs. Eleanor heard everything. She had lived long enough to know that cruelty was not always shouted. Often it was spoken casually, like weather. The auctioneer tried again, louder, Come on now, a bag of flour, that's all it takes. One bag for a woman who can keep your house running. A lanky man pushed forward from the second row, hat in both hands. He looked like someone who had been losing weight for months. His name was Eli Price, late 20s, narrow shoulders, sandy hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, eyes restless and ashamed. His shirt was patched at the elbows, and his boots had worn through leather near the toes. Eli cleared his throat twice before his voice came out. "She's my aunt," he said. The word sounded like a confession. "I brought her because we can't—" He stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. "My wife's expecting. Crops failed. We got nothing left but flour and debt." Someone in the crowd muttered, "Then let her go." Another said, "Better her than your baby." Eli's face tightened, as if each comment struck him physically. Eleanor finally turned her gaze to him. It wasn't accusing. It wasn't forgiving either. It was simply direct, and that directness made him drop his eyes. "I'm not asking anyone to pity us," Eli said quickly, voice rising with desperation. "I'm asking someone to take her. She's a good worker." The auctioneer nodded as though this explanation improved the business. "You heard the boy," he said. "A bag of flour, maybe two if you're feeling generous." The square had the stale smell of sweat and dust. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamped. A fly buzzed against Eleanor's cheek. She didn't swat it away. She was still, and the stillness made the laughter look uglier. At the edge of the crowd stood Silas Boone. He was 33, tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from long days on a saddle rather than from lifting weights. His shoulders were broad under a dust-colored coat, but his frame stayed narrow, all tendon and endurance. His face had sharp lines, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a week's worth of stubble that couldn't decide whether to become a beard. A thin, pale scar angled from the outer edge of his left eyebrow toward his temple. It looked old. It looked like it had mattered. His skin was browned by sun, and his eyes were an unsettled gray that kept moving, taking in details without lingering too long. He wore his hat low, but not low enough to hide those eyes. Silas wasn't from Dodge City, not truly. People knew him the way they knew storms on the horizon. He worked odd jobs, fence repair, cattle drives, hauling supplies, then vanished before anyone could ask questions. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't talk unless required. When he did speak, his words were measured, as if he was careful with what he released into the world. There was a quietness in him that wasn't shyness. It was restraint. The kind of restraint a man learns after the world takes something from him and leaves him alive anyway. Silas stood beside his horse, a sorrel gelding with a white blaze down its nose. The animal looked patient, but tense, ears flicking toward the platform, tail swishing at flies. Silas's hand rested near the reins, not gripping, just there. His jaw tightened as the auctioneer pushed again for bids. "A bag of flour," the auctioneer repeated. "Last chance." Silas took one step forward, then another. The movement drew attention immediately. A few heads turned. Someone whispered his name. Silas's boots sank slightly into the packed dirt as he made his way toward the table. He stopped at the auctioneer's side and set a leather pouch down on the wood. The sound was dull and heavy. The auctioneer's eyes dropped to it automatically, then widened. The crowd leaned in by instinct. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply spoke like a man stating a fact. "This ends," he said. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard by the certainty. "Sir, are you bidding?" Silas shook his head once. "I'm stopping it." A murmur ran through the crowd, part anger, part curiosity, part relief that something unexpected had finally happened. The stout woman scoffed. "What's your business?" Silas turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the people as if deciding who deserved his attention. When he answered, his tone stayed even. "My business is that you're calling this normal." The auctioneer found his voice again. "This is lawful. The family—" Silas cut him off without raising his volume. "Lawful isn't the same as right." He reached into his pocket, pulled out coins, and began placing them on the table one by one. Worn silver, a few gold pieces, enough to make the auctioneer's throat bob. Someone whistled. Another man muttered, That's months of wages. Silas looked up at Eleanor then, not at the crowd, not at Eli, not at the auctioneer, at her. His expression shifted, softening at the edges. The hardness stayed, but there was something else under it. Recognition, maybe, or respect that had been held back too long. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her like she was already owed basic courtesy. "I'm not buying you." Eleanor's breath hitched. She stared at him, trying to find the trick in his words. Men didn't pay money without expecting something, not out here. The auctioneer sputtered, "Then what is that money for?" Silas didn't look away from Eleanor. "For the lie," he said. "The lie that she belongs to anyone." He stepped closer to the platform and lifted his hand, not reaching for her, not grabbing. He held it open, palm up, steady. It was a working hand, large, scarred, the nails rimmed with dirt that never fully came out. The hand trembled slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Not fear. Something else. Like this mattered more than he wanted it to. "My name's Silas Boone," he said. "I've got a small spread west of here. It's not fancy. It's work. If you want a job, I pay wages. If you want to walk away and never see me again, you can, but you don't stand up here another minute while people laugh." A long pause settled over the square. Even the auctioneer looked unsure what to do with silence that wasn't his. Eli stared at Silas as if watching the ground shift. The crowd watched Eleanor's face, waiting for her to show embarrassment, gratitude, weakness, anything they could claim. But Eleanor only looked at Silas's hand, then at his eyes. She saw no hunger for ownership there, only a man who seemed tired of what the world demanded and stubborn enough to refuse it for a moment. Slowly, Eleanor stepped forward. The boards creaked, the sun burned, her feet ached. She placed her hand in his. Silas closed his fingers around hers gently, as though he understood what it meant to touch someone who'd spent years being handled without consent. He helped her down from the platform, careful where she put her feet. As she reached the ground, Silas removed a folded bandana from his pocket and offered it. "For your feet," he said simply. Eleanor hesitated, then wrapped the cloth around her soles as best she could. It wasn't proper footwear, but it was something. A small acknowledgement that pain mattered. Behind them, someone called out, half mocking, half curious. "Boone, why her?" Silas didn't stop walking. He kept his pace steady, guiding Eleanor through the crowd like a man escorting someone out of a fire. "Because someone should," he replied. Eleanor walked beside him. Her back stayed straight. Her gaze stayed forward. The drought still held the town. The dust still filled the air. But the platform was behind her. Now, and with every step away from it, something in her chest loosened, just a fraction, just enough to remind her that life could still change shape. At the table, the auctioneer began gathering coins with hands that shook. Eli stood frozen, hat in his grip, staring after his aunt with a face that looked older than it had that morning. The crowd slowly broke apart, disappointed the cruelty had been interrupted, yet unsettled by the fact that it had been so easy to interrupt. Eleanor did not look back. Silas led her toward the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the wind moved more freely. His horse followed, hooves quiet in the dirt. The sun remained harsh, and the road ahead looked long and dry, but the first choice Eleanor had been offered in years had already been made, and it felt, strangely, dangerously, like the beginning of something she wasn't sure she deserved. They left Dodge City by the West Road, where the buildings thinned into sheds and then into nothing at all. The heat followed them, but the noise did not. Behind them, the square dissolved back into its usual disorder, already forgetting what it had briefly witnessed. Ahead lay open land, flat, dry, and honest about its difficulty. The road was pale with dust and cut with wagon ruts that pulled at the feet. Silas walked slightly ahead, not out of impatience, but habit. Setting a pace that neither hurried nor dragged, Eleanor matched it without comment. Silas's horse followed on a loose rein. The gelding was a sorrel with a white blaze down its nose and dark, thoughtful eyes that watched everything. He was 15 or so, no longer young but steady, and his left ear bore a small notch from an old wire fence. Silas called him Red. Red walked with the careful economy of an animal that knew how to save strength, placing his hooves where the ground was firm, head low, ears turning toward every sound. He kept close to Silas's shoulder, as if he understood this was not a day for wandering. For a while, no one spoke. The road carried its own language, the soft grind of dust under boots, the faint jingle of tack, the dry rasp of cicadas in the grass. Eleanor felt the ache in her feet with every step, even through the bandana Silas had given her, but she didn't mention it. Pain was not new, and she had learned long ago that naming it did not lessen it. What was new was the absence of eyes on her back, the absence of laughter. She walked as if she were leaving a room that had never been hers. Silas glanced back once, subtle and quick, to be sure she was keeping up. When he spoke, his voice was measured, pitched low against the wind. "It's about 6 miles," he said. "We'll rest when we need to." "That's fair," Eleanor replied. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how little effort it took to keep it that way. They walked another half-mile before she spoke again. "You didn't ask my name," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. Silas nodded once. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted." She considered that. "Eleanor Price." "Silas Boone," he said again, as if setting the names side by side mattered. It did. Names were anchors. Eleanor hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had used hers without attaching it to a burden. The land opened wider as they went. Grass lay flattened and yellowed, and fence lines ran crooked where posts had shifted in the dry ground. The sky was vast and indifferent, and the sun pressed down without apology. Eleanor's shawl clung to her shoulders, damp with sweat. She loosened it slightly, and Silas noticed. "There's water up ahead," he said. "A hand pump by the old Johnson place." They reached it not long after, a leaning pump beside a collapsed fence, the boards gray with age. Silas worked the handle until rusty water splashed into a tin cup. He drank. First, not because he claimed it, but because he needed to know it wouldn't make her sick. Then he filled the cup again and handed it to her. Eleanor drank slowly, savoring the coolness despite the metallic taste. While they rested, a wagon approached from the east, its wheels creaking. The driver was a man in his 40s with a thick beard shot through with gray and a belly that spoke of better years. He wore a sweat-darkened hat and watched them with open curiosity as he slowed. His name, as Silas knew, was Martin Kessler, a freight hauler who ran supplies between towns. Kessler was not unkind by nature, but he had learned to be cautious. Drought made everyone cautious. "Afternoon," Kessler called, eyes flicking from Silas to Eleanor and back. "You folks headed west?" "That's right," Silas said. Kessler nodded, taking in Eleanor's bare feet wrapped in cloth. "Rough day to start a journey." Silas met his gaze evenly. "Every day's rough, one way or another." Kessler grunted, accepting that. He tipped his hat to Eleanor, a small courtesy that cost him nothing. "Ma'am?" Then he clicked his tongue and urged the wagon on. The wheels creaked away, and the road swallowed the sound. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You get used to people looking for a reason," she said. Silas nodded. "You get used to disappointing them." They walked on. As the afternoon wore down, the heat shifted from sharp to heavy. Eleanor's pace slowed, just a fraction, and Silas noticed. He stopped without making it obvious, adjusted Red's reins and waited. When Eleanor reached him, he pointed toward a stand of scrub where the land dipped slightly. "We'll rest there," he said, as if it had been his plan all along. In the shade, thin but welcome, Silas spread his coat on the ground. Eleanor hesitated, then sat, lowering herself carefully. Her knees protested. She ignored them. Silas crouched, took a biscuit from his pocket, broke it in half, and handed her the larger piece without comment. She accepted it, the simple fairness of the gesture tightening her throat. "You don't owe me explanations," Silas said after a moment. "But if you want to talk, I'll listen." Eleanor chewed slowly, considering. She was not used to choosing when to speak. Silence had been safer, but the road had a way of loosening things. "I taught school," she said finally, "before my husband died. Small room, 20 children, chalk dust everywhere. I was good at it." Silas nodded, encouraging without pushing. "When he passed, the school closed. No funds. I took work where I could. Houses, kitchens. My sister died. Eli was just a boy. I raised him." She paused, then added, not bitterly, "I don't blame him. Hunger makes poor judges." Silas's jaw tightened, not at her, but at the truth of it. He said nothing. Sometimes the right response was to let a sentence land. They rested until Eleanor's breathing evened out. Then they rose and walked again, the sun sliding lower, the light softening just enough to be deceptive. As the land dipped and rose, a low structure came into view, a house, if it could be called that, set back from the road. A small barn leaned nearby, its boards patched and mismatched. A corral enclosed a handful of fence posts and wire. The place did not look prosperous. It looked lived in. "This is it," Silas said. Eleanor stopped at the edge of the property. The house was plain. One story, weathered wood, a narrow porch with 2 steps. The barn's roof sagged on one side. A few chickens scratched in the dirt, thin but alert. Nothing gleamed. Nothing pretended to be more than it was. She looked at Silas. "This is your spread?" He nodded. "It keeps me fed." They walked closer. As they did, a dog appeared from beneath the porch, a medium-sized mutt with a graying muzzle and a coat that had once been black but had faded to charcoal. One ear stood up, the other flopped. The dog moved stiffly, the gait of an animal past its prime, but his tail wagged with cautious optimism. His eyes were dark and intelligent. "That's Buck," Silas said. "He's about 10, lost half his hearing but not his opinions." Buck approached Eleanor, sniffed her carefully, then sat back on his haunches as if waiting for her verdict. Eleanor crouched slowly and held out her hand. Buck sniffed again, then leaned into her touch, pressing his head against her knee. She smiled despite herself. "He likes you," Silas said. "He's sensible," Eleanor replied, the humor dry but real. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in a side room, a small stove with a kettle perched on top. Light came through a single window, dust motes floating in it like small planets. Silas set down his gear and gestured toward the side room. "You can take that room," he said. "It locks." The word landed carefully. Eleanor nodded. She sat on the edge of the bed, testing it. It creaked but held. She touched the quilt, patched but washed. Her shoulders sagged just a little, the first sign of fatigue she allowed herself. "I'll make something to eat," Silas said. "Nothing fancy." "That's fine," Eleanor replied. "I've never been one for fancy." As he moved about the kitchen, Eleanor watched him without staring. He was efficient, practiced. His movements suggested a man who had learned to do things himself because there was no one else to do them. When he worked, his brow furrowed slightly, a habit that spoke of concentration more than worry. They ate quietly, beans, bread, water. Buck lay at Eleanor's feet, snoring softly. Red stood outside, visible through the window, head down, resting one hind leg. When the light began to fade, Silas spoke again. "Tomorrow we'll see what needs fixing. There's no rush. You work at your pace." Eleanor met his eyes. "I don't expect charity." Silas shook his head once. "You won't get it." That seemed to satisfy her. Night settled over the spread, bringing with it a cooler air and the sounds of insects waking. Eleanor lay on the bed, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. It was not the uneasy quiet of a house waiting for demands. It was simply quiet. Outside, Silas sat on the porch for a while, Buck at his side, watching the stars come out one by one. The day replayed itself in his mind, not with doubt, but with a cautious sense of rightness. He had not planned this. He rarely planned beyond what the next season demanded, but for the first time in a long while, the road behind him did not pull at his feet. Inside the house, Eleanor closed her eyes. The ache in her body was real. So was the exhaustion. But beneath it ran something unfamiliar and fragile, like the first hint of water under cracked earth. Choice, she thought, and let the word settle. Morning came without ceremony. The light slipped through the narrow window and laid itself across the floorboards in pale bands, revealing dust that had settled overnight and the faint scuff marks of boots long used to this room. Eleanor woke before the sun cleared the horizon, not because she was eager, but because her body had learned to rise early no matter where it slept. For a moment she lay still, listening. The house held a quiet that was different from the one she knew. No coughing from another room, no muttered complaints, no unspoken expectations pressing against the walls. Just the low creak of wood cooling and the distant patient sound of a horse shifting its weight. She sat up slowly, testing her knees, then her feet. The ache was there, familiar and manageable. She dressed with care, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if the day might notice the effort. When she opened the door, the smell of coffee met her. Thin coffee, but real, and the sound of Silas moving about the kitchen with the restrained efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. Silas stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hair still slightly damp from the pump outside. In the clearer morning light, Eleanor noticed the small details she had missed the night before, the way his hands moved decisively but gently, the scar at his brow catching the light, the way his posture never fully relaxed, as if part of him stayed alert even in safety. Buck lay near the door, head on his paws, one eye open in lazy surveillance. Red stood outside the window, already saddled, ears flicking toward the house. "Morning," Silas said without turning, voice even. "Morning," Eleanor replied. She took the chair he indicated and accepted a tin cup of coffee. It tasted scorched and weak. She drank it anyway. They ate in companionable quiet. The food was plain, bread, beans reheated, but the rhythm of the morning settled into Eleanor like a remembered tune. Afterward, Silas set the cups aside and nodded toward the door. "I'll show you what needs doing," he said. "You tell me what you can manage." The land did not announce its needs with kindness. The fence along the north edge sagged in two places, posts loosened by dry soil. The barn roof leaked where boards had split and warped. A shallow ditch meant to catch runoff had filled with debris and would flood if rain came suddenly, as it sometimes did after weeks of nothing. Silas walked the perimeter with Eleanor beside him, explaining without instructing, pointing without ordering. Red followed, unbothered, while Buck trailed behind, occasionally wandering off to inspect something invisible. Eleanor listened. She did not interrupt. When Silas finished, she stood still for a moment, eyes moving across the spread, measuring distance and effort. "The fence first," she said. "North side. If it goes, the rest won't matter." Silas nodded. "I figured you'd say that." They started there. Silas, "Fetch tools. Wire, a post driver, a shovel." Eleanor tested the loosened post with both hands, braced her feet, and shifted it back into alignment with a practiced movement that surprised even her. Silas watched without comment, then stepped in to help tamp the soil. They worked in a rhythm that required little talk, each anticipating the other's next move. Eleanor noticed how Silas never rushed her, never corrected unless she asked. He treated her not as fragile, but as capable, and the distinction mattered. By mid-morning, the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down. Eleanor wiped her brow with her shawl and paused. Silas noticed and handed her the canteen without ceremony. She drank, then handed it back. "You learned this somewhere," she said, gesturing to the fence, "not just from doing." Silas shrugged. "My father ran cattle. He believed land listened if you paid attention." He paused, then added, quieter, "He died when I was 20. Took me a while to figure out what he meant." They moved to the barn. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled of old hay and dust. Sunlight cut through gaps in the boards, illuminating the sagging roof. Silas climbed the ladder first, testing each rung, then called down instructions. Eleanor stayed below, sorting boards, handing up nails, keeping track of what could be salvaged. Her mind worked quickly, seeing patterns, remembering techniques from other places, other lives. When Silas descended, sweat-streaked and dusty, she pointed to a corner beam. "That one's cracked. It'll hold for now, but not through winter." Silas followed her gaze. "I didn't see that." "You weren't looking for it," she replied, not unkindly. Different eyes. He smiled at that, brief but genuine. Near noon, a rider approached from the east, kicking up a thin line of dust. Silas straightened instinctively, hand resting near his belt, not on the revolver, but close enough to acknowledge its presence. Eleanor noticed and stayed still. The rider came into view. A man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a heavy beard streaked white and a face weathered into permanent squint lines. He sat his horse with the ease of long habit. His name was Thomas Calder, a neighboring rancher whose land bordered Silas's to the south. Calder reined in at the fence, eyes moving from Silas to Eleanor with open curiosity. "Didn't expect company," he said. His voice was deep and roughened by years of shouting over wind. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. "Didn't expect it either," he replied evenly. Calder dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. Up close, his size was more apparent, thick through the chest, arms corded with muscle, beard untrimmed but clean. His gaze lingered on Eleanor's hands, then her face. "You hire help?" he asked. I did, Silas said. Calder nodded slowly. Good luck to you, he said, and there was no mockery in it, just assessment. Fence on the north needs work. Wind'll take it otherwise. We're on it, Silas replied. Calder's attention returned to Eleanor. Name's Calder, he said. If you need anything you can't find here, I run to town every few weeks. Eleanor Price, she answered. She met his gaze without flinching. Calder tipped his head, a small gesture of respect. Ma'am. Then he mounted and rode on, dust settling behind him. When he was gone, Silas exhaled. He's fair, he said. Doesn't like trouble. Neither do I, Eleanor replied. They worked until the heat grew heavy and the shadows shortened. Buck dozed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to watch them with mild approval. Red grazed, content. By afternoon, the fence stood straighter, the barn roof temporarily secured, the ditch cleared enough to function. It wasn't finished work. It was enough. They broke then, sitting in the shade with water and bread. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly from exertion. She noticed and curled them into her lap until the shaking passed. Silas pretended not to see, then quietly shifted tasks for the remainder of the day so she could rest while still contributing. Sorting supplies, planning repairs, marking boards. It was a small kindness, delivered without fuss. Later, as the sun dipped and the light softened, a wagon appeared on the distant road. It slowed as it neared the property, then stopped. A woman climbed down, young, perhaps 20, with a slender build and dark hair braided tightly down her back. Her dress was plain but clean, and her eyes were sharp with worry. She introduced herself as Lila Moore, a schoolteacher passing through on her way west after her position had been cut. She asked for water. Eleanor fetched it without hesitation. Lila drank gratefully and spoke in quick, careful sentences. It's hard everywhere, she said. Children leaving school to work, families splitting apart. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the pattern. Silas listened quietly, arms crossed, absorbing the confirmation of what he already knew. When Lila left, dusk had settled. The sky burned orange and pink, then dimmed to blue. Supper was quiet but easier than the night before. There was a sense of shared effort now, of ground gained. Afterward, Eleanor stepped onto the porch. The air was cooler, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant water. Silas joined her, Buck settling between them. For a long moment, they watched the horizon. You don't owe me anything, Silas said finally, as if continuing a thought from earlier. But if you decide this isn't for you, say so. I won't make it difficult. Eleanor considered him. I won't stay where I'm not wanted, she said, but I won't leave a thing half done either. He nodded, accepting the terms. Inside, Eleanor lay down with muscles aching in honest ways. Outside, Silas sat a while longer, listening to the land. The day had demanded work and given back a measure of quiet. It wasn't generosity. It was balance. Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing exactly what tomorrow would ask. And for the first time in years, she believed she could answer. The first sign that the land was changing came quietly, the way most important things did. It was not rain, not yet, but a shift in the air, a heaviness that settled in the mornings and lingered through midday. The sky stayed stubbornly clear, but clouds gathered far off on the horizon, tall and slow, as if deciding whether Dodge City and its outlying spreads were worth the effort. Silas noticed it while he stood at the pump, working the handle and watching the water rise. He had learned to read the land the way other men read faces. It did not promise relief, but it hinted at it. Eleanor noticed too. She felt it in her joints before she saw it overhead, a dull ache that came with pressure building somewhere beyond sight. She didn't comment on it at first. Instead, she folded herself into the rhythm of the days. Mornings began early. She swept the house, fed the chickens, and sorted supplies with a quiet competence that made the small rooms feel purposeful rather than bare. Buck followed her from room to room, his stiff gait improving slightly as if the regular movement agreed with him. He was an old dog, but not finished. His coat shone more now, brushed daily by Eleanor's patient hand. Silas spent the mornings outside, checking fences and walking the property lines. He returned for a midday meal, then went back out to work until the light began to fade. He spoke little during these hours, not out of coldness, but because he was used to labor being its own language. Eleanor understood that. She spoke when there was something to say. One afternoon, while sorting grain sacks in the barn, Eleanor found a small ledger tucked into a crate. It was old, the pages yellowed and soft at the edges. She opened it and scanned the neat, careful handwriting inside. Numbers, dates, short notes in a hand that was not Silas's. She did not read far before she recognized the tone of it, measured, deliberate, the work of someone who believed order could hold chaos at bay. When Silas came in, she held it up. "This yours?" she asked. Silas stopped short. His expression changed, not sharply, but enough to notice. "It was my wife's," he said after a moment. "She kept the accounts." Eleanor nodded, understanding more than he had said. She was thorough. "She liked things to make sense," Silas replied. He took the ledger from her, fingers lingering on the cover. "I haven't looked at it in years." "You should," Eleanor said gently. "Not to remember. To continue." That night, Silas sat at the table with the ledger open before him. Buck lay at his feet. Eleanor worked nearby, mending a tear in a shirt with practiced stitches. The lamplight softened the lines in Silas's face as he traced the entries. He didn't speak of what he felt, but the tightness in his shoulders eased as the evening wore on. When he finally closed the book, he set it back where it belonged, not hidden, but placed. The next morning brought visitors. A wagon rolled in just after sunrise, its wheels loud in the quiet. Silas stepped onto the porch, hand resting casually at his side. Eleanor stood behind him, shawl drawn close. The driver climbed down, a man in his early 30s, lean but strong, with dark hair cut short and a beard trimmed neatly enough to suggest a preference for order. His clothes were clean, his boots well cared for. He introduced himself as Jonah Hale, a livestock agent from Dodge City. Jonah's eyes moved over the property with professional interest. "I hear you've got a decent patch of grazing," he said, "and fences that might hold if they're finished right." Silas regarded him evenly. "Depends who's asking." Jonah smiled slightly. "Fair enough. I buy and sell on commission, mostly cattle, sometimes land." Eleanor felt Silas tense beside her. The memory of the auction lingered in the air between them, unspoken but present. "I'm not selling," Silas said. Jonah raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Didn't say you were, just offering options." His gaze flicked to Eleanor, curious but not disrespectful. "Times are hard. Men get tired." "Some of us get stubborn," Eleanor said calmly. Jonah studied her, surprised, then nodded. "That can be useful too." He tipped his hat and left as easily as he had arrived, leaving behind a thin unease that took time to fade. Afterward, Silas exhaled. "I don't like men who talk about options," he said. Eleanor considered that. "Options aren't always traps," she said, "but they're rarely free." The days pressed on. Work continued. The fence held. The barn roof stayed intact. The clouds on the horizon grew taller, darker. One afternoon, the wind shifted sharply, carrying the smell of rain. Buck barked once, then fell silent, ears pricked. By evening, the first drops fell, tentative, spaced far apart. Eleanor stepped onto the porch and let one land on her palm. She laughed softly, surprised by the sound. Silas watched her from the doorway, something loosening in his chest. The rain did not last long, but it was enough. The ground darkened. The air cooled. That night, they slept with the windows open, listening to the distant thunder roll away. The following morning, Eleanor rose with purpose. "The ditch will hold now," she said over breakfast, "but the south fence won't if the ground softens." Silas nodded. "We'll get to it." They worked together, Silas driving posts while Eleanor measured and steadied. Her movements were slower than his, but precise. When her hands tired, she rested without apology, then resumed. Silas adjusted without comment. The work was not shared equally, but it was shared honestly. Near midday, a rider approached again, this time from the north. He was younger than Calder, perhaps mid-20s, with sandy hair and a nervous way of holding himself. His name was Aaron Whitlow, a hired hand from a neighboring spread. He brought news. Cattle had gone missing farther west. Tracks suggested they had been driven, not wandered. "Rustlers?" Silas asked. Aaron shrugged. "Maybe. We're desperate men." His eyes flicked to Eleanor, then away. "Figured you'd want to know." Silas thanked him. After he left, Eleanor spoke. Desperation doesn't make a man careless, she said. It makes him bold. That evening, Silas checked his rifle and revolver, movements careful and familiar. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "I've seen what fear does to people," she said. "It turns them inward." Silas nodded. "Or it turns them loose." They sat on the porch as night settled. Buck lay between them, red visible in the dim light, head low. The stars emerged slowly, one by one. Silas broke the quiet. "You don't have to stay if this gets dangerous," he said. Eleanor turned to him. "I told you, I don't leave things half done." She paused, then added, "And I don't run from men who think fear makes them powerful." Silas studied her face, lined and resolute. He saw not recklessness, but conviction shaped by experience. "All right," he said quietly. The next day, Eleanor took the ledger out again. She spread it on the table, pencil in hand. "If we're staying," she said, "we should know exactly what we have and what we owe." Silas smiled, faint but real. "I was hoping you'd say that." They worked through the afternoon, counting supplies, estimating repairs, planning for winter. The work was slow, careful. It grounded them both. As dusk settled, Eleanor stepped outside. The air smelled of damp earth and promise. She felt the ache in her bones, but also a steadiness she had not known in years. Staying, she realized, was not passive. It was a choice made daily, with effort. Inside, Silas closed the ledger and looked around the room, at the mended shirt, the swept floor, the quiet presence that had filled the space without demanding it. For the first time since his loss, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like a weight he carried alone. They said little that night. Words were unnecessary. The land had demanded work, and they had answered. Whatever came next would find them already standing. The rain did not return the next day, but its promise lingered in the ground. The soil stayed dark and soft beneath the surface, and the grass, what little had survived the drought, lifted its color just enough to suggest that patience might still be rewarded. Silas felt it under his boots as he walked the south fence line at dawn, testing posts with his weight, listening for the telltale creak of loosened wire. Red followed at a measured distance, hooves careful, breath steady. The horse had carried Silas through worse seasons than this, and his calm was not indifference but experience. Eleanor watched from the porch for a while, then returned to the house to prepare the day. She had fallen into a pattern that felt natural rather than imposed. Bread rising near the stove, the ledger opened on the table, a list of repairs penciled neatly in the margin. Buck lay in a patch of sunlight, tail thumping once whenever Eleanor passed. The dog's hearing was poor, but his awareness was sharp. He lifted his head at unfamiliar sounds, even when Silas did not. By mid-morning, the wind shifted again. It came from the west, dry and restless, carrying dust and the faint smell of cattle. Silas returned to the house, face set in the way Eleanor had learned meant he was thinking ahead rather than reacting. "Calder rode by earlier," he said, accepting the cup of water she handed him. "Says he lost 2 head last night." Eleanor absorbed that. "Taken or scattered?" "Taken," Silas replied. "Tracks were clean. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." She closed the ledger slowly. "Then they'll come again," she said. It wasn't fear in her voice. It was assessment. They spent the afternoon making quiet preparations. Silas checked the corral and moved Red closer to the house. He counted ammunition, not with urgency, but with care. Eleanor secured the doors and windows, then stepped outside to gather the chickens early, coaxing them into the coop with practiced patience. Buck stayed close, his tail low, body angled toward the open land. As dusk settled, the sky took on a bruised color, purple and gray layered thickly, the clouds hanging low. The air felt tight. Silas lit the lamp early, its glow steady and contained. They ate in silence, both listening. When the meal was finished, Eleanor cleared the table and paused, hands resting on the wood. "If they come," she said, "they won't expect resistance." Silas met her gaze. "I'm not looking for a fight." "Neither am I," she replied, "but I've learned that being ready can change a man's mind." Night fell fully. The land went quiet in the way it did before trouble, not peaceful, but alert. Even the insects seemed subdued. Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and scanned the darkness. Eleanor joined him, shawl drawn close. Buck sat between them, ears pricked. They waited. It was close to midnight when Red shifted suddenly, snorting softly. Buck rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Silas stiffened. He listened, breath held, and heard it too. The faint, deliberate sound of hooves, distant but approaching. Not a herd. A few riders. Careful. Silas motioned Eleanor back into the house. She did not argue, but she did not retreat far. She stood just inside the doorway, where she could see and hear. Silas moved to the edge of the porch, keeping to shadow. 3 figures emerged from the darkness near the south fence. They dismounted quietly, leading their horses by the reins. The men were strangers, their shapes indistinct in the low light, but their movements were practiced. One was tall and narrow, another broad-shouldered, the third shorter, quick. They spoke in murmurs too low to catch. Silas stepped forward just enough for his presence to register. "That's far enough," he said, voice calm and carrying. The men froze. The tall one straightened slowly. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a coat that had seen hard travel. When he spoke, his tone was almost friendly. "Evening," he said. "Didn't mean to trouble you." "You already have," Silas replied. The broad-shouldered man shifted, impatience in the movement. He had a thick beard and a scar along his jaw, the kind that came from a knife rather than an accident. The third man stayed back, eyes darting. "We're just passing through," the tall man said. "Figured we'd water the horses." Silas shook his head once. "There's water east," he said. "You won't find it here." For a moment it seemed the exchange might end there. Then Eleanor stepped into the lamplight. She did not raise her voice. She did not brandish a weapon. She simply stood where she could be seen, posture straight, gaze steady. "You're not lost," she said. "And you're not thirsty. You're looking for cattle that don't belong to you." The tall man's eyes narrowed. He took her in, her age, her stance, the certainty in her tone. He smiled thinly. "Evening, ma'am. Didn't expect company." "Men rarely do," Eleanor replied. The broad-shouldered man laughed under his breath. "We don't need trouble," he muttered. Silas lifted the rifle just enough to make the message clear. "Then you should leave." The tall man hesitated. He glanced at his companions, then back at Silas. In that pause, Eleanor saw calculation at work, not bravado, not cruelty, but survival weighed against risk. Finally, the man nodded. "Another night," he said quietly. "Another place." They mounted and retreated the way they had come, their silhouettes swallowed by the dark. Only when the sound of hooves faded completely did Silas lower the rifle. Eleanor released a breath she had been holding. Her hands trembled slightly, but she folded them into her shawl until they stilled. Buck remained at attention for several minutes longer, then lay down with a huff, satisfied. They did not sleep much after that. Silas kept watch until dawn, the sky lightening inch by inch. Eleanor sat at the table, the ledger open but unread, listening to the quiet return. When the sun finally rose, it felt earned. Later that morning, Calder arrived, grim-faced. He listened as Silas described the encounter. "You did right," Calder said. "They'll move on." "For now," Eleanor added. Calder studied her, then nodded. "For now," he agreed. The day passed slowly, tension lingering like a bruise. Yet something had shifted. Silas noticed it when he repaired a gate without the familiar knot in his chest, when Eleanor moved through the house with calm authority rather than caution. Fear had come, tested them, and found them standing. As evening fell again, Silas sat on the porch, Eleanor beside him. The land lay quiet, honest in its difficulty. "You didn't have to step out," Silas said finally. Eleanor looked at the horizon. "I know," she replied, "but I chose to." Silas nodded, accepting the weight of that choice. The night had taken something from them, the illusion of safety, but it had given something back in return. Proof. They went inside as darkness settled, the lamp lit, the door secured. Outside, Buck made one last circuit before lying down. Red shifted in his pen, calm again. Whatever came next, they had already faced the worst of it together. The morning after the night encounter broke clear and cool, the sky rinsed pale by a breeze that carried the smell of damp earth and trampled grass. Silas rose before the light fully took hold, his body moving on habit while his mind replayed the careful pauses of the men who had come and gone. He walked the south fence line again, slower this time, eyes trained on the ground rather than the horizon. Tracks told stories if you listened. He found them where he expected. 3 sets of boot prints pressed into softened soil, horses turned away with deliberate care. No panic, no rush. They had come prepared. They had left because it made sense. Eleanor joined him not long after, shawl wrapped close against the lingering chill. She didn't ask what he had found. She knelt and studied the ground herself, fingers hovering just above the prints as if touch might blur the evidence. "They'll remember this place," she said quietly. "Men like that do." Silas nodded. "And we'll remember them." They marked the tracks with stones, then let them be. There was work to do that did not wait for worry. Eleanor returned to the house and set about the morning with purpose, baking bread and boiling coffee, the ordinary acts grounding after a night that had stretched the hours thin. Buck followed her, tail swaying, his ears lifting at sounds that did not come. Red stood near the barn, calm again, chewing with slow patience. The land had settled. People had not. By mid-morning, Silas saddled Red and turned east toward Dodge City. He had not planned to go in so soon, but the night had drawn a line he did not intend to ignore. Eleanor watched him from the porch, reading his posture as she had learned to do. "You'll speak to the sheriff," she said. "Yes," Silas replied. "And to Calder." She nodded once. "I'll keep the place." He hesitated, then reached into the saddlebag and left the rifle leaning by the door. "In case," he said. "In case," Eleanor agreed. The road to town was quieter than it had been days before, dust tamped down by recent moisture. Dodge City came into view in its familiar sprawl of wood and noise, the sound of hammers and hooves mixing with voices raised in argument and laughter. Silas rode straight to the sheriff's office, a squat building with a star nailed to the door that had seen better years. Sheriff Amos Rourke looked up from his desk as Silas entered. Rourke was a man in his early 50s, broad through the chest and softening at the middle, with a gray-streaked beard kept trimmed short and eyes that missed very little. He had been a marshal once, farther west, before a bullet took part of his hearing and all of his appetite for glory. He listened more than he spoke now, and when he did speak, people tended to pay attention. "You look like a man who didn't sleep," Rourke said, leaning back. "I didn't," Silas replied, and laid out the story without flourish. The approach, the words, exchanged, the retreat. He did not exaggerate. He did not minimize. Rourke nodded slowly. "You did right," he said when Silas finished. "You don't fire unless you must. You don't chase unless you know where it leads." He stood, pulled a ledger from a shelf and made notes. "Calder lost cattle. Others will have too. We'll ride the lines, put eyes where they'll be seen." Silas hesitated. "They weren't drunk boys," he said. "They were organized." Rourke's mouth tightened. "That's what worries me." From the sheriff's office, Silas went to Calder's place. The older man met him by the gate, sleeves rolled, forearms marked with old scars that spoke of rope burns and stubborn stock. Calder listened, jaw set, then nodded. "I'll tell the neighbors," he said. "Men don't steal alone. They test. If they don't like what they find, they move on." "Or they come back with more," Silas said. Calder shrugged. "Then we'll know who stands." Silas returned to the spread by late afternoon, the ride giving him time to think. He found Eleanor in the yard, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with flour, Buck asleep in the shade nearby. She looked up as he dismounted. "You spoke to Rourke," she said, reading it in his face. "Yes." "And Calder?" "Yes." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Good," she said simply. They walked the property together again, checking gates, reinforcing wire where needed. Eleanor suggested small changes, moving a lantern, clearing brush near the fence, practical measures that did not shout fear, but acknowledged reality. Silas implemented them without question. He trusted her judgment now, and the trust moved easily both ways. Near evening, a wagon arrived from the North Road. The driver was a woman in her 30s with a sturdy build and a sun-browned face, hair tucked beneath a plain bonnet. She introduced herself as Maeve Collins, a seamstress who traveled between farms mending clothes and earning meals. Her eyes were quick and observant, her manner brisk but warm. Eleanor welcomed her without hesitation. Maeve worked at the table while they spoke, needle flashing, fabric passing through her hands with practiced speed. "Town's uneasy," she said. "Men counting their stock twice a day, women sleeping light. She glanced at Eleanor. You're the one who left the auction. Eleanor met her gaze evenly. I am. Maeve smiled. Good, she said. It needed ending. Maeve stayed for supper, then took a pallet in the barn, Buck checking her scent and deciding she was acceptable. The night passed quietly, and when morning came, it brought a visitor who did not arrive by chance. The rider appeared near midday, alone, hat tipped low. He dismounted well outside the fence and waited, hands visible. He was younger than the men from the night before, mid-20s perhaps, with a narrow face and a beard that had grown in unevenly. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots scuffed. There was something unsettled in his posture, as if he were used to moving when told. Silas approached first, rifle left by the door but not forgotten. State your business, he said. The young man swallowed. Name's Peter Lang, he said. I worked for a man out west. He hesitated, eyes flicking to Eleanor. I came to say you were right to stand. Silas waited. Peter shifted his weight. The men you saw? They won't come back here, not soon. You made it costly. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. They're headed south. Eleanor stepped forward then. Why tell us? She asked. Peter met her gaze, then looked away. Because I've done things I don't like, he said quietly. And because you didn't shoot when you could have, he paused. That matters. Silas studied him, weighing the risk. You give us names? He asked. Peter shook his head. Not safely. He mounted quickly after that and rode away without looking back. The day settled into an uneasy calm. Maeve departed with thanks and mended seams. Eleanor and Silas said little about Peter, but they adjusted again, moved stock, shifted routines, kept watch without spectacle. That night, as they sat on the porch, Eleanor spoke. I used to believe staying meant enduring, she said. I see now it means choosing. Silas nodded. Choosing. And being seen choosing. The stars came out one by one. Buck made his rounds. Red shifted, then stilled. The land lay quiet again, not because danger had passed, but because it had been acknowledged. Inside, Eleanor opened the ledger and made notes of the day, repairs, visitors, plans. Silas watched her write, the steady movement of pencil across paper, and felt something settle that had been restless for years. Lines, once drawn, could not be unseen. They could be crossed, but never forgotten. They turned in knowing the next days would ask more. They would answer together. The days that followed settled into a quieter vigilance. Not peace. Silas knew better than to name it that, but a steady watchfulness that did not drain the body the way fear did. The land responded in small ways. The grass held its color longer after dawn. The ditch filled and emptied as it should. At night, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a softer hand. These were not promises. They were acknowledgments. Eleanor marked the changes first. She rose early and walked the short distance to the south fence, checking the wire and the ground beneath it. She had begun to carry a small notebook in the pocket of her apron where she recorded practical things, where the soil stayed softest after rain, which posts needed replacing before winter, how much grain remained after each week. The act of writing steadied her. It was a way of insisting that days mattered. Silas watched this from a distance, careful not to intrude. He had learned that Eleanor did not need oversight, only room. He spent his mornings riding the perimeter with Red, extending his checks beyond their own land, stopping at Calder's place and 2 smaller spreads farther north. Men were wary but receptive. Trouble had a way of turning neighbors into something closer than friends. At Calder's, Silas found the older man mending a gate, sleeves rolled, beard tangled with gray. Calder worked slowly now, his shoulders still broad but his movements measured. Years earlier, a fall from a horse had crushed his knee. It had healed, but not cleanly. Pain had made him patient. Nothing new, Calder said when Silas asked, but that doesn't mean nothing's coming. Silas nodded. I'll keep writing. You're doing more than that, Calder said, glancing at the horizon. You're staying. Silas did not answer immediately. The word sat heavy and unfamiliar. Staying had never been his strength. On the 3rd day after Peter Lang's visit, Dodge City sent another messenger, not a rider this time, but a boy with dust up to his knees and a voice that cracked when he spoke. His name was Jonah Finch, maybe 14, all elbows and sharp curiosity. He delivered a folded note from Sheriff Rourke. The handwriting was blunt and economical. 3 men arrested south of the river. Not your visitors, but related trouble. Keep watch. We will too. Silas thanked the boy and gave him water. Jonah lingered, eyes darting over the property, the animals, Eleanor moving inside the house with quiet authority. You're the place folks are talking about, he said finally. Silas raised an eyebrow. Talking how? Jonah shrugged. Like it's different. Eleanor stepped onto the porch then. Jonah flushed and tipped his head awkwardly. She smiled, not warmly, not coldly, but with a reserved kindness that acknowledged him without inviting inspection. The boy swallowed and backed away, suddenly aware that he had said more than he intended. When he left, Eleanor watched him go. Stories move faster than horses, she said. Yes, Silas replied. And they last longer. The following afternoon brought a visitor who did not come cautiously. A buggy pulled in at an unhurried pace, driven by a man in his early 40s with careful posture and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a plain dark coat despite the heat, his hat clean, his boots unmarked by hard travel. His name was Nathaniel Crow, and he introduced himself as a clerk for a regional grain cooperative forming farther east. His voice was measured, his manners deliberate. Crow surveyed the land with professional interest. There's talk of pooling resources, he said. Shared storage, fairer pricing. It won't help everyone, but it will help some. Silas listened without interruption. Eleanor listened more closely, noting the man's eyes, the way they lingered on numbers, on potential, rather than on people. What would it require? She asked. Crow smiled slightly. Commitment, records, trust. Eleanor nodded once. We can keep records. Crow inclined his head toward her. I can see that. They did not agree to anything that day. Crow left pamphlets and promises and a sense of possibility that felt heavier than it looked. After he departed, Silas sat at the table, the papers spread before him. I don't like promises, he said. Eleanor touched the edge of a page. Neither do I. But I like preparation. That evening, they worked through the ledger together, aligning old entries with new realities. Silas was surprised at how easily the numbers began to make sense again, as if the act of attention itself restored order. Eleanor's handwriting filled the margins, clear, firm, patient. He realized then that what she brought was not simply labor or courage, it was continuity. A week passed. No new riders appeared at night. The cattle remained where they were. Buck's vigilance relaxed into something closer to contentment, though he still rose at unfamiliar sounds. Red regained weight, his coat taking on a healthier sheen. The house felt lived in rather than occupied. One evening, as the sun lowered and the air cooled, Eleanor remained outside longer than usual. She stood near the fence, watching the light change the land's color. Silas joined her, leaning against a post. For a while, neither spoke. I used to think home was a place you were allowed to stay, Eleanor said finally. Then I thought it was a place you were needed. Silas waited. Now, she continued, I think it's a place you choose to be responsible for. Silas considered that. Responsibility had always sounded like a burden to him. Now it sounded like an anchor. That night, a storm gathered. Not violent, but determined. Rain fell steadily, soaking the ground thoroughly this time. Eleanor and Silas moved through practiced routines, checking doors and windows, securing the barn. The house held. The ditch did its work. Water flowed where it should. In the small hours, Eleanor woke from a dream she could not name. She lay listening to the rain and felt unexpectedly safe, not because danger was absent, but because it had been met before and could be met again. Morning brought clean air and the smell of wet earth. Eleanor stepped outside and laughed softly at the sight of green pushing stubbornly through the brown. Silas watched her from the doorway, the sound settling somewhere deep in his chest. Later that day, Calder returned, this time with 2 neighbors in tow. They were men Eleanor had not met before, both weathered, cautious, carrying the quiet pride of people who worked land that did not always love them back. They spoke plainly. They offered to share night watches for a time. Silas accepted without ceremony. As they talked, Eleanor prepared coffee and listened. She did not insert herself into the conversation, but when a question turned to winter stores, she answered it clearly. The men looked at her then with something that resembled respect rather than curiosity. It was a subtle shift, but it mattered. When the neighbors left, Silas turned to Eleanor. "They'll come back," he said. "Not because they're afraid, because they trust you." Eleanor nodded. "Trust is work," she said. "Like anything else." That afternoon, they made a decision neither had named until it was already in motion. Eleanor cleared the spare shelf and placed the ledger there permanently. Silas moved his coat from the chair to a peg by the door. They planted a small patch of late greens near the house, not because the yield would be large, but because tending it required intention. At dusk, Silas took Red out for a final circuit. Eleanor stood at the porch, Buck at her side, watching until horse and rider merged with the land. When Silas returned, she was still there. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. They sat together as night settled, the stars returning one by one. Dodge City lay distant, its noise reduced to memory. The land before them was imperfect and demanding, but it was known. Home, Eleanor thought, was not something given or taken. It was something built, day by day, with choices that did not announce themselves as brave until later. Silas felt it too, though he did not put it into words. He knew only that the road behind him had finally loosened its grip. They went inside when the air cooled, closing the door with a sound that was firm but unforced. Outside, Buck made his rounds. Red shifted, then settled. Whatever lay ahead would find them here, not passing through, not waiting to be told where they belonged, but standing where they had chosen to stay. The first frost came earlier than anyone expected. It did not announce itself with spectacle, only a thin white crust along the grass at dawn, and a breath in the air that carried the bite of winter. Eleanor noticed it when she stepped onto the porch and felt the boards cold beneath her soles. She stood for a moment, drawing the shawl closer, and watched the light lift from the land. The spread looked different under frost, cleaner, sharper, every line made honest. Silas had already been up for hours. He moved through the yard with Red, checking tack and testing a gate hinge that had begun to stiffen with cold. The horse's coat had thickened, his breath puffing in steady clouds as he worked. Red was older now, past the age of impatience, and he bore the cold with the same calm he had shown through heat and threat. Buck followed at a respectful distance, his muzzle graying further, his pace slower but deliberate. He had learned the rhythms of the place and guarded them without fuss. Winter demanded accounting. Eleanor brought the ledger to the table and began the careful tally of what they had. Grain measured, stores stacked, tools repaired and set where they could be found in the dark. She wrote clearly, the pencil steady. Silas watched from across the room, coffee steaming between his hands, and felt something settle as the numbers took shape. They were not rich. They were not desperate. The margin between those two states felt narrower than it used to, and that, Silas realized, was the difference. By late morning, Calder arrived with two men Eleanor recognized from earlier visits. They spoke plainly, without bravado. The talk was of winter watch schedules, shared supplies if the snow came heavy, and the grain cooperative Crow had mentioned. Calder's voice carried weight, not because he was loud, but because he had learned to choose words carefully after pain had taught him the cost of careless ones. As they talked, a rider approached from the south, alone, unhurried. He dismounted at the fence and waited. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad, with a beard worn long and a face lined by sun and disappointment. His name was Isaac Mercer, a drover who had lost his herd to rustlers weeks before. The loss had changed him. It showed in the way his shoulders sloped forward, in the careful distance he kept from hope. He spoke quietly. "I hear you're standing together," he said. "I'm asking if I can stand with you." Silas studied him. Eleanor did too, reading the steadiness beneath the weariness. "We don't take men we don't know," Silas said. "But we don't turn away need either." Isaac nodded, relief and restraint mixing on his face. "I'll earn it," he said, and meant it. They set him to work that afternoon, not as a test, but as a beginning. Isaac moved deliberately, grateful for instruction, respectful of boundaries. He asked questions when he didn't know, and listened when answers came. Eleanor noticed how he handled Buck, slowly, with patience, and marked it as a sign worth keeping. The days shortened, the cold deepened, snow came in fits, then settled in earnest. Work became heavier, time tighter. Eleanor's joints ached more now, but she did not withdraw. She shifted tasks instead, focusing on planning and repair that could be done indoors. Silas adapted without comment. Isaac proved steady. Calder's men took their turns on night watch. The land held. One night, as wind drove snow against the house in steady sheets, Silas woke to Buck's low warning. He rose quietly and stepped to the window. Shadows moved at the edge of the corral, not men this time, but cattle pressed too close together, nervous in the weather. Silas went out with Isaac, working by lantern light to calm and separate them. Eleanor watched from the doorway. The ledger closed for once, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. The work was done without incident. When Silas returned, snow clinging to his coat, she met him with a nod that said enough. The turning point came not with violence, but with paper. In early winter, Nathaniel Crow returned, this time with documents and a plain confidence that had not been there before. He explained the cooperative's terms carefully. Shared storage, agreed pricing, obligations laid out in ink rather than promise. Eleanor read every line. She asked questions Crow answered with respect. When she finished, she set the papers down. "We'll join," she said, "but we won't overextend." Crow smiled, a genuine one this time. "That's how it lasts," he said. When the ink dried, something changed in the way people spoke about the place. Not loudly, just enough. Dodge City's noise faded further into the background as the spread became known for what it did rather than what it feared. Isaac stayed on. Calder visited more often. Jonah Finch delivered notes with a new ease, no longer wide-eyed, but attentive. Late one afternoon, Eleanor stood at the fence and watched Silas work. He moved with a purpose that was no longer defensive. The scar at his brow caught the low light, and she wondered, briefly, tenderly, what it had taken from him and what it had given back. When he noticed her watching, he smiled in that quiet way that did not ask for response. They spoke that evening by the fire, not because something needed deciding, but because the silence had grown companionable enough to hold words without urgency. "I've been running most of my life," Silas said, eyes on the flames. "I thought stopping meant losing." Eleanor considered that. "Stopping is how you see what's left," she said. He nodded. "What remains," he corrected softly. Winter deepened. Snow piled and melted and piled again. Eleanor fell ill briefly, a cough that worried Silas more than he let on, but she recovered with rest and care. Isaac took on more outside work. Calder checked in daily. Buck slept closer to the fire now, Red sheltered and fed with a diligence that bordered on affection. The last piece fell into place quietly, as these things often do. On a clear morning after a long snow, Silas found Eleanor at the table with the ledger closed and a single sheet set aside. "I've been thinking," she said, "about spring, about the work ahead." Silas waited. "I don't want to be a guest anymore," Eleanor continued, "or an employee." She met his eyes. "I want to be a partner." The word landed with weight, not romance. Silas felt it settle in his chest, solid and undeniable. He did not answer immediately. He thought of the road, of the nights spent watching shadows, of the mornings that now felt earned rather than borrowed. "All right," he said finally, "then we do it properly." They marked the agreement that day, not with ceremony, but with signatures and witnesses. Calder stood with them. Isaac did too, steady as a fence post. The paper was plain, the meaning was not. Spring came late but honest. The ground thawed. Green returned in stubborn patches that spread with patience. Eleanor planted again. Silas repaired what winter had tested. Isaac prepared to bring in cattle of his own, small at first, careful. The cooperative delivered fair prices. The ledger grew thicker. On a warm evening, as the sun lowered and the land breathed, Silas and Eleanor sat on the porch. Buck lay between them, asleep. Red grazed within sight. Dodge City was a memory rather than a threat. "We chose this," Silas said. "Yes," Eleanor replied, "and we'll keep choosing it." Home, she understood now, was not a place secured by locks or fear. It was measured by what remained after weather and worry had taken their share. What remained was work worth doing, people who stood when standing mattered, and a future shaped not by rescue or regret, but by deliberate care. They went inside as night cooled the air, closing the door with a sound that was firm and final. Outside, the land rested. Inside, the ledger lay open to a new page, ready for the season ahead. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a hand that reaches out when the world turns away, through courage that chooses kindness over fear, through love that shows up when hope feels too tired to stand. Perhaps this was not chance. Perhaps God placed two broken lives on the same road so they could remind each other what dignity looks like, what home feels like, and how grace often works in silence, not by changing the whole world at once, but by changing one heart, one choice, one ordinary day. In our own lives, we may feel unseen, forgotten, or convinced that our best days are behind us, but faith tells us something different. It tells us that no life is wasted, no season is meaningless, and no soul is beyond redemption. God still writes new beginnings, even on pages we thought were finished. If this story touched you, take a moment and ask yourself, where might God be inviting you to believe again? Who around you may be waiting for a quiet act of mercy? Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe that no person, no child, and no animal should ever face fear alone, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal and remind us of God's love. May God bless you and keep you. May He bring comfort to your home, strength to your heart, and light to your days ahead. And may you never forget, miracles still happen, often in the simplest, quietest ways. Amen.